Number 13, return from captivity. Number 14, years of silence. 15, life of Christ. 16, early church. 17, letters to Christians. Before we start class this morning, I've got my folks with me here today. I asked my dad to pick a number between 1 and 17 and to say it to my mom so that way he wouldn't pick something on the fly. So what was your number this morning, Dad? 5. So let's go back. Period 5 is going to be our period of the Exodus. Let's just for a brief moment think about where does this within the confines of Scripture, so like what book or about what chapters of what book would this material take place, and what are just some of the highlights of this particular period. So throwing the softball here, the Exodus period takes place in the book of Exodus. There we go, good. So when we think about this period, though, in the period of the Exodus, how would you define that period as far as chapters within the book of Exodus? Would you say it's the whole period? Some, Caden?
Wouldn't it be through Exodus 1 to, I think it's 14?
So 14, 15, 16, 18, 19, depends on where you want to make that halfway point of Exodus. So Exodus 14 would be what, Cade? Right, so that's when they cross the sea. Chapter 15 is the Song of Moses, where they kind of talk about that again through the more poetic form. So whether you want to count that as the divide, or whether you want to count them actually arriving at Mount Sinai somewhere around chapter 18 or 19, that would be what we might consider the actual Exodus event. Whereas when you're in the wilderness, wandering in the wilderness, you would include that period from we've crossed the Red Sea, now getting to Mount Sinai, and that whole year-long period for the rest of the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus and the first 10 to 11 chapters of Numbers, somewhere in there, would be the beginning of this wandering in the wilderness period that continues into, or the more common we know, of the 40-year wandering. So within those first, whether you want to call it Exodus 1 to 14, 1 to 18, somewhere in there. We'll have a more defined limit as we continue on in this class. We'll make some of those limits and decide those as a class together. But what are some of our highlights from the book, or from this period of the Exodus? Ms. Rebecca?
Well, the main highlight was the giving of the law and the setting up the covenant at Mount Sinai.
Right.
That to me ought to be number 6 on this, is the covenant between God and Israel.
Right.
Because it actually covers most of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy really repeats it,
Mm-hmm.
and some of Numbers.
Right.
Much more emphasis is put on the establishment of the covenant,
Yeah.
the building of the tabernacle. The people agree that God will be their God and they're going to obey
Mhm.
everything that He says.
Yeah.
Realize I didn't. That to me is maybe the second most critical thing in the Bible, other than the second covenant, which is what God made with us through Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like it ought to have a standalone.
Maybe its own standalone period. That doesn't quite fit with this, but we could make sure that as we continue to talk about period 6, we'll bring that out. You know, it's not just the 10 Commandments in chapter 20 of the book of Exodus, and then we move on to that weird section from chapters 25 through 30 where there's all of this. This is supposed to be the pomegranates on the priest's, skirts, and the cherubim on the walls of the tabernacle. There's a giving of the covenant there around chapter 24, isn't that right? And that's a very important part of when the people actually are entering into that covenant and setting up that covenant. With our Exodus period, period 5 here, what are some of our main Exodus events? All right, I'm getting a couple of things I hear in the back. Brother Roy? You got the bread from heaven, the manna, that would be around chapter 16 or 17. What else? The plagues would take place there, and the beginning chapters are kind of those middle chapters of that section. What else? Who's our main character or characters? Moses is kind of a big deal in this period and really going forward into the next one as well. Joshua and Caleb are going to be in there. Who are some of our antagonistic characters that we want to know about? Pharaoh, the Egyptians are the kind of main issues or the main problems that the people are up against, as well as their own hearts at times, but they would be the Canaanites as well. They're going to start to maybe encounter some of them, or they're getting ready to encounter some of them. So again, at times we're going to try to pick out a period. Maybe I'll randomly ask someone to pick a number between 1 and 17 like I did this morning, or we'll just pick 2 periods and say, how do these connect? We're going to start adding some more dots along the way. So thinking about when we're going to eventually get to period 5 in the Exodus, you're immediately conjuring up Moses, plagues, manna, crossing the Red Sea, Egypt, Pharaoh. When we'll get to period 6, you're going to be thinking about the covenant, the 10 commandments, the tabernacle, the golden calf, the 40-year wandering. You'll start to have some of this information ready to go, so that if I just mention the Exodus, some of those things are going to quickly come to mind. Right, Tracy? I'm just kidding. All right, it's all fine. So let's get into our class for this morning. We are continuing some sections with this history and geography material by Brother Bob and Sister Sandra Waldron. We are getting into this part 2 of the geography of Palestine. I've picked a very unfortunate time to have a baby, where it was right between a part 1 and a part 2 lesson, but that's just the way that goes sometimes. So we are picking up with this thought of focusing on various sections of the land of Palestine, or Palestine. Probably Palestine is how we're going to pronounce it in the Bible. Palestine is that place in East Texas. It's very small up here, but if you have your workbook, if I can get this to come up, you can see your Roman numerals that kind of break up this land into 4 parallel sections. In our last class, we focused on Roman numerals 1 and 2. Those were the coastal plains where people like the Philistines live, and then the hill country, which is really focused to some places in the north that are going to include like Tyre and Sidon, but also that main area of Galilee and of what's eventually going to become Samaria and the New Testament, and then, of course, Judah or Israel and the land that the tribes are going to control. And the tribes will control various parts of that land throughout their history. We're getting familiar with some of the geographical or typographical information or locations within that area. We're going to get more into Romans numerals 3 and 4 with all of that, the Jordan Valley, and then the Trans-Jordan Plains. Before we get to that, let's do a little bit of review about this area. This goes back to lesson 2. All of these classes, next week is going to be specifically a review class. Lesson 5 is a review lesson. But even now, as we're doing review, if you have a workbook, that workbook is meant for you to be used as an open book at all times. There's never going to be a closed book test where I'm going to enter grades into a computer system and then judge you and report that to Peter so he can calculate that for your heaven score someday. That's not how this works. This is something that is meant to benefit us and helping us to build this information. So if you want to look back to lesson 2, what are our 4 names for the land that we use for this area? We call Palestine, that'd be the more modern name for that. What are the other 3? The land of Israel, Canaan, originally it starts as Canaan, and then what's our other one?
Land of promise.
Put those together, the promised land, the land that's flowing with milk and honey. Those are our 4 terms for this land. And as we're studying this particular area, starting out within lessons 2 through 4, why are we studying geography? Number 1, to get to know the homes of those people who God interacted with. If you want to try to understand Abraham or Moses or Joshua or David, one way to really help us further understand them as characters with the good foundation and the necessary facts of the Bible is to think, what was the land like that they lived in? How did the area that they lived in shape them? How did that maybe influence some of the decisions of why they were successful or why they failed as God's people? As we'll look at some things today in a moment, the nations around God's people, and see why maybe some of those nations would have constantly been at conflict with God's people, other than the fact that just, people war and that's just how things seem to be. If you want to know someone, you want to try to understand their home, you want to try to understand their history and background. If you really want to try to learn some more about your preacher you've only known for about 10 months, his origin is here today. You can ask his mom and dad and say, what was Jeff like as a kid? And get to know that guy a little bit more other than the guy that you've just known for these 10 months here. You want to know someone. That's why we look at the geography. We look at the history of the Bible story. So let's get into our periods or our places for today. If you've got a lesson book, you can open up to page 14 and follow along on there. If you've got a Bible, you can be opening up to Joshua chapter 3. That'll be our passage we get to here in a little while. It's not going to be right away, but fairly soon here we're going to be in Joshua chapter 3. So our third area, our third parallel section of the Promised Land, of Canaan, of Palestine, is going to be this area called the Jordan Valley. As you can see, it's focused there with what's circled with that oval, but even would technically be a part of this greater area known as the Great Rift. This crack in the Earth's crust where these fault lines come together. Just briefly thinking about some things that relate to this particular area. If I can make sure I understand how clickers work. I'm going too far. That's what's happening right now, Jeff. So from there you have the Great Rift is something that's going to begin on the northeastern shores of the Mediterranean and goes all the way down into the eastern parts of Africa. It's quite a big area that's covered in there. As we're thinking about the Jordan Valley, though, this just one part of the Great Rift. That's what's known as El Gore today. They bring out in our notes or in our material. Just this section that we're focusing on is that area between the Galilee or the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. This area is very fertile. It's got some tropical life growth, is what they refer to that as. While it's a fairly small area, it's not necessarily as wide or as big as the hill country to the west of it. Oh, I pushed the wrong button. Hopefully that doesn't come back to me. So the hill country over here is a lot wider area, but here in the Jordan Valley, it's a very small, pretty much just stays right by the Jordan River and follows along that path. And you see the green on the map to kind of influence the tropical-like growth. When you think of something like a jungle, what are some animals you think of that live in the jungle? Lions, right? You think about lions being mentioned in the Bible. For a long time I thought, why is a lion just out in complete desert? And maybe there are some lions more in desert areas. You think about Samson, he encounters a lion. If he's in the tribe of Judah, close to the Philistines, that's going to be much more in this area, but maybe there's some more tropical-like area over there where lions would be. When you think about lions being mentioned in the Bible or some of those type of creatures, it could be that you're thinking about areas along the Jordan River here. Some detail to help us think about that. When you think about the Jordan River itself, one of our main places in scriptures, what are some Jordan River stories you know about? John the Baptist works by the Jordan River, baptized people in the Jordan River. In Joshua chapter 3, the people of Israel cross the Jordan River, very similar to the Red Sea crossing. What happens there around in Joshua chapter 3, chapter 4? Did they just build a bridge and hop on over? Did they get a boat and paddle across? It parted, right? It's very similar to the Red Sea there. It parted, or the water stopped some ways up there. On the Jordan River, some facts about this for us to consider or know. It's 11 miles from Lake Hula, which is no longer in existence today. That is if you can see this little space right above the Sea of Galilee, there's a little blue dot. That's Lake Hula is how I'm going to pronounce that. To the Sea of Galilee, it's about 11-mile distance from there. Beyond that, it's going to descend another 100 feet, and the 65 miles to reach the Dead Sea. The Jordan River is going to cover 80 miles from Mount Hermon, which is north of our territory here, closer to this northern part of the map. You can see just the beginning of the word mountain there. Maybe you can see the beginning of the word mountain there, and goes down to the Dead Sea. That's about 80 miles of land, I think you would say, as the crow flies, but it's about 200 miles of winding river. So while the river looks pretty straight on our maps, from what I understand, and I haven't been to the Jordan River, it sounds like it's maybe a little bit more of a switch back and forth, and it's also a very quickly declining area. You're going to be constantly going downhill from Mount Hermon, basically where water would, I think, get source there and come off of the snow, or have come off of that, what do you call that, downpour or the down runoff, and would work its way down eventually into the Dead Sea. Now, the Jordan River, as we're thinking more about that, the riverbed varies from 80 to 180 feet wide with an average about 5 to 12 feet deep. So if you were to cross the Jordan River, if it's 5 feet deep, or if it's maybe a dry season, it could be that, the people could just cross the Jordan River, no problem. But when you think about that story in Joshua chapter 3, where I asked you all to turn, we look in Joshua chapter 3 and verse 15, the Jordan Valley is 14 miles wide at Jericho, and it was a flood season when the Israelites crossed. So if it's a flood season, what are we going to infer about the river? Is it going to be a low river time or a high river time? A high river time. So when we read in Joshua chapter 3 and verses 15 and verse 16, as soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped into the brink of the water. Now the Jordan overflows at its banks throughout the time of harvest, through this time where there's great rain. In verse 16, the waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zithron, and those flowing down from the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite Jericho. So at this particular area, we're not talking about a small amount of water. We're talking about a significant amount of water that, again, we're seeing God's power when he stops that water and allows his people to cross. And after they all cross through, remember, right, as the priests are coming out, those who are carrying the ark, the waters come back and are going to resume their flow. But this is again, significant body of water, not just to notice or to identify on our map, but something we read about constantly in the stories of the Bible. Isn't it Naaman, as well as told to dip in the Jordan River as well? That's another one of our Jordan River stories. So as we're going to encounter the Jordan River along the way, think about this area, think about this very tropical-like area that's quickly descending down, pointing towards the Dead Sea. I think we've got just a little bit more of that information there. Thinking more about the Jordan Valley and then this area of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is famous for being the lowest point on earth. It is almost 1,300 feet below sea level. It's 48 miles long, a maximum of 10 miles wide. So like we mentioned, it's below sea level about 1,300 feet. And then to get to the bottom of the sea itself is about another 1,300 feet. When you look at this, you look at the Dead Sea. Why do we call it the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea? Thoughts about that, or if you've read your material? Nothing lives in there. Nothing goes out of it. And so you see all these rivers are coming together, and that point is made, and you can kind of see it on our screen here. This information, or this fact, says 6.5 million tons of water flow into the Dead Sea each day. So you have the Jordan River and the Arnon River and the Zered rivers all flow into the Dead Sea. But nothing is going to flow out of it because its evaporation is so great. And that means that about 25% of the water is solid material. So you can float very easily. It's 5 times saltier than the ocean. Miss Julia, did you get a chance to float in the Dead Sea when you were over in that? Did you get over to the Jordan River at all or experience any of that?
I'm sure we did, but I don't remember the whole experience.
It was a lot to take in. It was a couple of weeks, was that right? Or about 10 days? Or
No, I was on a cruise, and we came into Jerusalem and Nazareth.
Yeah.
Places like that.
And it was, did you cover some of the other Mediterranean area as well? Is that right? Or was it pretty much just Israel?
Oh, we hit Cairo. And,
Okay. Yeah. So you probably didn't have time to
Turkey and
book into, to that area and then book it out.
each place.
Yeah, that's right. But if you've ever, has anyone else ever been to the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea? Do you know Benjamin Lee? Benjamin Lee is a preacher who's currently in the Dallas area, preaches for West Main Church in Louisville. I can't find the picture, but he had this video of him floating around in the Dead Sea, just kind of, he's not trying to hold his breath and keep himself up like I used to do in swim class and thought that was so amazing when I was 5, and the times that I was actually courageous enough to let go of the wall. But, you can just sit in that water and you can float around very easily. Buoyant, would that be the correct term for all of that? Thank you all for helping me try to look smarter than I am. I don't know why I try to use these words, so I don't know what they mean. But that gives us some information about that. This is really an area that we know. We recognize the name of it. It's talked about some in Scripture, but there's not really a whole lot that happens there. I mean, fish that are going to go from the Jordan River into the Dead Sea have a very unfortunate future for them, as in they have really much no future for them. They're going to die there within that water because of how salty and how uninhabitable it really is. Continuing down farther south of the Dead Sea, though, as we're still in this Jordan Valley area, still within this fairly tropical section is the Arabah, this section that's very trough-like valley that gradually rises. So you've been very much descending over the past 80 miles or so. You're starting to dip back up, or starting to go back up as you continue south into the Arabah. And this section is barren and rugged kind of valley, although you're still seeing some of that green growth within that section. As we get to our map here, before we get to the Trans-Jordan Plateau, I need a volunteer this morning. Is anybody feeling courageous or brave to do some identification of some of our landmarks we've talked about. Boy, just Tracy. Danny said Tracy is. Look at that. Tracy, one of our elders here to give us wisdom. That button right there is our laser pointer, sir. And so I need you to just point to the Jordan River for us. You figure it out? Did I turn it off? Let me see if I can get that on for you.
I can do the Jordan. That's about it, though.
Oh, I bet you can do more than that. Is that right, class? Is he in the right place? There we go. Boom. I think he pointed at the bottom, so we're going to have to take a half point off of that. All right, what about Lake Hula?
I knew that. That's up there.
That's right there. There we go. What about Sea of Galilee?
Up there. I started to do that one. But
Oh, there you go. All right, there's our Sea of Galilee. What's the next one?
there's the one I was.
There's the one you're about to do, the Dead Sea. Let's get some of our rivers. The Yarmouk River.
I'm going to take a while. Let's go to the middle.
Any encouragement or thoughts for Brother Tracy about maybe a direction to go? Maybe go a little bit more north?
One of these?
One of those right there. So I think you would call the main one that branches off the Jordan there. Our next one is the Jabbok. What about that, Brother Tracy? There you go. Keep going. I bet we're going to figure out a pattern here in just a second. The Jabbok River. The next is the Arnon.
I will try this one.
Boom. There you go. And then finally, the Zereth River right down there. We got one more place, the Arabah we just talked about. Where is that, class?
Did the bottom.
Right there at the south of the Dead Sea. If you remember, we were in Deuteronomy chapter 2 at the end of February. And in Deuteronomy chapter 2 and in Deuteronomy chapter 3, it recounts some events from the end of Numbers where they're starting to work their way through the Edomite territory into the Moabite territory. It talks about them crossing the Zereth River and them getting close to the Arnon River. And so as you see those things, start to try to think about, okay, that's not just two words I'm glazing over, but where are those on my map? Is that in the Promised Land? Is that outside the Promised Land? Where are these places in relation to where God's people are living or what they're doing within that time period? Great job, sir. You did awesome. And be prepared. Tracy has done his due time for now, so that means someone else. Danny, you might get volunteer next time, so watch out. Be prepared. All right, let's continue on further east of the Jordan River, talk about our final section, the Trans-Jordan Plateau. You remember as we talked about the Lebanon Mountains and the anti-Lebanon Mountains that go across from, I think it's, as you continue up north of the Jordan River, this is a section that continues to go down of that mountain range. While maybe not necessarily you would call them mountains, this is definitely going to be a higher elevation than what you see west of the Jordan River. So the extension of these mountains, you see that these mountains on the east side are higher than those on the west side. And an important note would be thinking about Deuteronomy chapter 34. Mount Nebo, where Moses looks into the Promised Land, would be a much better vantage point for him to see into the Promised Land rather than one of the mountains maybe there in the just western part of the Jordan itself. They're on this Trans-Jordan or eastern part of the Jordan Mountain. Have you ever gone up a high mountain and taken the time to look around and to see how far you can look and how far you can see? When I was in New Mexico, in not Amarillo, that's in Texas, I think. When I was in New Mexico in Albuquerque, not long ago for that gospel meeting with the Sandia Church, we took some time to go up the Sandia Mountain and look from that peak. And on a clear day, if I remember right, it's about 60 to 70 miles to Santa Fe, and you can see Santa Fe from that mountain. And that just blows my mind as somebody who grew up in Indiana, where the highest mountain was probably the top of a hill on a country road, and you can maybe see an extra couple hundred feet or something like that. But to think about what you could actually take in or notice or see like that, maybe it gives you a little bit more perspective or appreciation for what's going on within these biblical events. Continuing with the Trans-Jordan Plateau, really significant to us is going to be the people and the regions that are in that area. We're going to be reading about, especially in our Old Testament history, and talking about these groups of people. To the north of the Trans-Jordan Plateau, we have the Land of Basian. This would be usually under Syrian, not Assyrian, under Syrian control. South of that would be the land of Gilead, and this section between the Yarmouk and the Jabbok, and maybe even down a little bit into the Arnon River. This would mostly be where the tribes who were on the eastern side of the river would control or inhabit when they were within that area. Who are our tribes on the eastern part of the river? Half of Ephraim, or half of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. There we go. We got those people over there. They were shepherds. And within this area, as they're right by the Jordan River, this would be a great place for them to do their shepherding, as long as they look out for lions, right? Again, thinking about how you would encounter some of those animals within this place would make more sense, at least to me now, as I'm putting some of those events together and thinking about that. South of them would be Moab, kind of a little bit more in the desert area. South of them would be Edom. And then to the east of Gilead would be the Ammonites. The Moabites and the Ammonites are connected to the Israelites how? Through Lot. Those are Lot's descendants, from we read about in Genesis chapter 19. Edom is connected to the Israelites through who? Esau, the brother of Jacob. So you have some family connections there. Remember when they went through, or getting ready to go to the promised land, when they got ready to cross the Zered River and they were going through Edom, God told them, I've given Esau and his descendants this area. Don't take that from them. This is not your place to go and to take their land. I've given them this land. They've driven out their giants and their warrior-like people. You'll drive out your giants and warrior-like people, and you'll get your promised land. But they get this area, just like the Moabites and the Ammonites have been given this particular area. Now, our authors of our material made a point that stood out to me in the fact that when you look at people like the Ammonites, where are the Ammonites in relation to maybe habitable, good land? The Ammonites are like in the Midland, Odessa, compared to the Israelites who are in the East Texas of, land and topography. Where the Ammonites are right by the Arabian desert, you're not going to have a whole lot of fertile area and soil. So you could see why they're constantly trying to nip at or buckle into some of that Israelite territory in Gilead. So as we read about some of those squabbles or some of those fights or some of those wars, whether in the days of the judges or at other time periods, you can see maybe why some of that's taking place, some maybe strategic background, other than also the fact that sometimes God is using those people and says he's using those people to punish or to show his power in some way as well. As we're finishing up this morning, at least with some of our geography-related things, a couple of trade routes that have been pointed out along the way. This goes back to lesson 3. If you look to page 11, you can read about what's known as the Way of the Sea. So this would be a trail that goes along the coastal plain, a trade route that goes up to, all of these are eventually going to lead to Damascus, but you can follow this dotted line down. It's going to follow right along the sea. There'd be maybe people from Egypt heading up towards Mesopotamia who would use this way, staying along the coast as they're traveling or following along this path. It's going right through. What territory would this be, or who would these people be in this area? The Philistines would be a busy route through there, as well as it says on our slide over here through Megiddo. What's Megiddo? What's significant about that?
It protected the pass at Mount Carmel.
Mm-hmm.
A defense.
A defense city, lots of important area for military and commercial strength. If you want to really make some good military presence, and if you want to make sure you're well defended, and if your goods are well defended, you want to have control of Megiddo. Lots of battles happen at Megiddo, and lots of illustrations or prophecies that use Megiddo as an area for battlegrounds. I think that's Ezekiel, and even Revelation uses Megiddo as references to that type of fighting area. Our next trade route is going to be this trade route that runs up through the hill country. So it's known as the Way of Shur. This would have been mostly an Israelite-used trade route. Maybe some people from Egypt would go along this way. But if you're going to travel a long distance from somewhere in Africa trying to get to Asia, or maybe even, I don't think this would be the way you would go to get to more of the European area, but if you're going to travel, this would be a lot of Israelites who would go through here, which makes sense. As you're following this dotted line that starts here in the bottom left part of our map, you're going up along the way, you're going through Judea, you're going through what's getting close to Galilee, crossing right below the Sea of Galilee, and it's going to eventually meet up with our third trade route we're going to talk about in just a moment. Our last one being this Way of Kings, or the King's Highway. The Way of Kings is a book that I read. Sorry, I got that confused. This is going to be on the eastern part of the Jordan River, and this is going to be a lot of commercial trade rather than crossing through the Arabian desert. If you want to get to Babylon to sell some goods, if you want to go from Babylon and trade some goods here in this area, this very fertile area, if you want to make your way down into Egypt or Africa, you're going to go along this way. There's a lot of wars that are fought just to control this particular trade route and this particular land within this trade route that I already just said. So Great redundancy there, Jeff. Lots of things covered as far as, again, just more geographical stuff, but helping us to maybe see some things. I particularly want to remind us about things like the Jordan River. Look for where the Jordan River is mentioned, and maybe look for some other rivers that are connected to that, or some other cities that are mentioned to that, and say, where does this follow along the way? And hopefully you're detailing your map on your own and using this as your own reference guide. I mean, yes, there's a fully colored map provided for you, but when you take the time to actually draw out your own map and color it in, I can't remember who it was, but one of the presidents is noticed saying, when you cut your own firewood, you warm yourself twice. And so while you spend some time looking at the information and learning the information, when you draw it out and color it in on your own, you're really retaining that and really trying to ingrain some of that information. And not just to say, haha, I know more than the people who are at the church building that's, with inside of here. It's to say that I'm trying to better understand God's people, better understand how God is relating to people, and ultimately how we can take inferences and lessons and applications from that as well. So all of that, any questions, comments about the Jordan Valley, the Trans-Jordan Plateau, or the land of Palestine at all before we close this morning? Mr. Charles?
One of the things that amazed me about, crossing the Red Sea and also the Jordan River there, God stopped the water, of course. But it said they walked across on dry land. If you've been in any river or any creek, everything's going to be muddy. That's a secondary miracle, if you want to call it that. If they walked across on dry land where there had been standing water for forever.
Yeah, I mean, I played in a couple of lakes in Indiana where we jump out of a boat and you get stuck and you gotta wait for somebody's dad to come pull you out. But they have to worry about that. They walked through and they were perfectly fine as they got across. And then as the waters come back over, the Egyptians have some things to worry about. And that's a good point about that crossing there. Anything else about this area or this land before we go, Bo? That's right. If you're going to try to pull that to say, it wasn't that deep when the people, it was just hitting their calves. Well, then how did the Egyptians not know how to swim? Did they all just fall down and drown face down in the water like that? That's a good point about thinking about those details. When people try to attack the stories of the Bible, to attack our faith and say, I want to look at this geography, I want to look at this landscape and say, this is why you shouldn't believe the Bible. Hopefully we're, strong enough to maybe that does catch us off guard. Maybe there are some things we haven't heard before. We can calm and collect ourselves and say, let's go back to the text of the Bible, and what is the Bible really showing me here that says why I can trust and need to trust this and have my faith strengthened as well. Next week, like I mentioned, we're going to be doing some review of lessons 2 through lessons 4. If you have a workbook, you notice that it is all just review questions. And basically, it's going to be look at this on a map and remember the names of these things. And so there are 2 ways to do this. Number 1 is the way where we just come in and I just click the button on my iPad or on my clicker and say, what is this? And you say a name, and it comes up on a screen, and we say, good job. Or what I'd like to try next week is we're going to divide ourselves, and we're going to have a little bit of friendly competition. And so you'll find yourselves arranged in some way where hopefully we can get some folks on Team A and Team B, or you want to call yourself the Team 1 and Team Awesome, whatever. You can decide that later. We'll do some review like that. That way it's a little bit more engaging and some things to think about. But look over your lessons, review those things, bring your books with you. That will be an open book review you can use for that, as it still continue to help us to review some of this land. After lesson 5 and lesson 6, we'll do an overview of the Old Testament lands outside of Palestine, so places like Babylon, places like Egypt, places like Assyria. And lesson 7 will be New Testament lands, maybe thinking about Rome and some of the other territories around that. Lesson 8 will be some chronological information and data. And then lesson 9, we'll finally get a little bit more of, okay, what's going on in Genesis 1 through 11? What about our before the flood and scattering of the people periods? Let's start filling in some gaps, filling in some details along the way with that. So stick with me for a little bit more of this geography section. If you feel like you're kind of getting stuck with it, hopefully, you're finding it to be encouraging and you're seeing some things and learning some things along the way too. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. And then we'll get more into some of that, opening our Bibles even more and filling in details and information along the way. Thank you for your comments and for your attention today. I guess really more for your attention. I don't give you all much chance to talk in these classes. Thank Tracy for being our guinea pig and letting him point out those maps, and thank you for helping him out as well. We'll go ahead and end class a little bit early, and we'll get started with our worship service about 10:30 this morning. Thank you all for being here today.